Paul once looked at John Mark and decided not to bring him along. Years later, that same Paul told Timothy to get Mark and bring him because he was useful for ministry. Same Mark, same Paul, completely different verdict. So what happened in those two moments to cause such a shift? Here's the uncomfortable part. Paul may have not been wrong to refuse him the first time, and Barnabas may have not been wrong to fight for him. Let's be honest, this isn't a story about grace pretending failure never happened. It tells the story of how a man who had become a liability rediscovered his usefulness. If you've ever wondered whether a single failure can permanently alter your future, you should see what happened to John Mark. John Mark was not from the fringes of the Christian movement, since his mother Mary had a house in Jerusalem where believers gathered. That was the house Peter went to when he got out of prison. And that matters because Mark was not the same stranger who came into the story late. He was raised in a house that was right in the life of the church, around praying people and apostolic stories. Remember, he had a foot in another strong network because he was related to Barnabas. Mark was raised in the heart of it all. By the time Barnabas and Saul took him along as an assistant, this probably did not seem like a random adventure for him. Acts gives us a world where households, relatives, and church communities connect. So Mark enters the mission through relationships, not isolation. He knew this man, and he had seen enough to know this work mattered. In Acts 13:5, Luke calls him their assistant or their helper, which sounds modest, but it still puts him inside the work. He was not in charge of the mission, but he was on it. And that's the point. At first, the journey may have felt familiar, since Barnabas came from Cyprus, and that part of the mission was known ground. But then something started shifting. Paul moved to the front. The work pressed into harder territory, and they reached Perga in Pamphylia. The mission moved, the terrain changed, and the leadership dynamic was shifting. Then Luke gives us one short sentence, and that sentence would follow Mark for years. Acts 13:13 puts it in one plain sentence by telling us that John left them and returned to Jerusalem. That is all Luke gives us. No speech, no explanation, and no attempt to soften the blow. We don't understand why he left. We only know he did. Acts 15 shows us exactly how Paul remembered it, which gives us something more useful than a theory about his motive. Paul did not see this as a simple change of travel plans, but remembered Mark as someone who withdrew and did not stay with them in the work. Luke used a basic verb for leaving in Acts 13, but when Paul talks about it later, in Acts 15, the language is stronger. In Paul's opinion, Mark had deserted the job. Mark hadn't gone into the work with them, and that was Paul's problem right there. So the next time his name comes up, this one sentence from Perga is still sitting there in between them, and it's like this cloud hanging over his reputation. In Acts 15, Paul wants to go back and strengthen those young churches by going back to the cities where they had preached to the believers. That's important because this second trip doesn't feel like a casual tryout for the uninitiated. And Paul is thinking about the strain and the burden of the travel to come. Then Barnabas wants to take John Mark again. And all of a sudden, everything that happened in Perga comes flooding back all at once. Barnabas wants to take him, but Paul does not. Paul thinks it is wrong to take someone who withdrew in Pamphylia and did not go with them into the work. And Luke does not hide the force of the moment. He says the disagreement became so sharp that they separated from each other, using a word that carries a lot of heat. This is not a mild difference in ministry preference, but a painful break between two friends. And let's be real, this is where Christians often make the story too simple. Paul wasn't asking if Mark could be forgiven, but if he could be trusted with this specific assignment. Do you see it? Those are not the same questions. That alone makes the reading of the scene different. A man can be in Christ and not ready for a specific burden, just like a failure can be forgiven long before trust is restored. Paul is not trying to erase grace, but he is judging readiness. One can be loved and welcomed and not fit for frontline responsibility. Paul is protecting the work, while Barnabas is protecting the worker. Think about it, because both of those instincts really matter. If all you have is Paul's instinct, People can get frozen inside the worst chapter of their life, where every failure becomes a label and a sentence that never ends. But if all you have is Barnabas' instinct, you can push people back into burdens they are not ready to carry, and then call it grace when it is really just impatience. The church does not need harshness without mercy, and it does not need mercy without seriousness, but it needs people who know how to tell the truth about weakness while leaving room for growth. Barnabas does not deny that it was a failure, but he just won't believe that one failed season has to determine the entire future of Mark. That was the man Barnabas always was, for Acts had already shown him stepping towards people everyone else distrusted. When Saul first arrived in Jerusalem after his conversion, the disciples were terrified of him, but Barnabas took him and brought him in. Barnabas had a history of seeing what a person could become, rather than focusing only on what terrified everyone in the present, and he does that again for Mark. And Paul fits his own pattern too, because he had been entrusted with hard work in hard places and knew exactly what the road could demand. He knew the mission would not get easier as they went, and he also knew that a team can break at its weakest point. So he looks at what happened in Perga and he says no. Luke refuses to turn either man into a villain, and there is no speech from heaven rebuking Paul for being too hard or Barnabas for being too soft. Barnabas takes Mark and sails to Cyprus, while Paul takes Silas and moves through Syria and Sicilia. The split hurts, but the mission does not die, and instead it actually multiplies. So who was right? Hold that question for a moment, because Mark has a serious problem on his hands. One apostle does not trust him. His own cousin has had to fight for him, and two major leaders have split, with his failure at the center of the debate. What does a failed man do when the Bible stops talking about him? The Bible goes quiet about Mark for a long time, and maybe that is the point. Restoration usually looks ordinary while you are living through it, and Mark gets no dramatic comeback scene. What we get instead are quiet signs that his story kept moving. Barnabas takes him and keeps investing in him, and Peter later refers to Mark as his son. Mark does not rebuild alone. He stays near men who can steady him, correct him, and keep him serving. And here is what seems to happen in those silent years. He keeps showing up, he keeps serving, keeps learning, and gives trust time to heal. And there is a stage of wound healing called remodeling, where the skin looks closed, but underneath, strength is still returning. That is what many believers miss. Closure is not the same as restoration, and trust does not grow back in one emotional moment. Mark's silent years look like this. No platform, no rush, just consistent faithfulness until the man Paul could not trust became the man Paul would one day ask for by name. The payoff finally comes in 2 Timothy 4:11, when Paul tells Timothy to go get Mark and bring him because he is useful in ministry. Slow down and really hear those words, because Paul is no longer simply allowing Mark to exist at a safe distance. He specifically requests for him and wishes to have him by his side, implying that the man he previously refused for the journey is now the one he seeks for in his hour of need. This happens late in Paul's life, when he is lonely and in need. So he's not just being polite or throwing out a cheap compliment. He says Mark is useful to me. The same guy who walked out and caused a huge fight is now the person Paul wants nearby. And you have to notice how direct that is. Paul does not say Mark is merely forgiven. He says Mark is useful, which is language about real service and real trust in the work. Mark is not being tolerated as a sentimental gesture to show that Paul got softer as he got older, but he's being called out by name because Paul believes he can actually do the job. That word useful is big because it shows us that the restoration has become practical. This is not just about inner healing or feelings, but it touches on fitness and dependability and what a person actually contributes to the mission. Mark can now be counted on. And I don't mean in theory, I mean in the actual hard work of ministry. This does not erase what happened at Perga or the split with Barnabas, and scripture does not try to pretend those things never happened. The beauty of this moment is not that the past vanished into thin air, but that the past did not get to have the final word. There is one more thing here that we need to see. Paul's view of Mark means something changed in the young man, but it also means something changed in Paul too. Paul was capable of a very harsh judgment when the mission was on the line, but was also capable of changing his mind when years of evidence proved he should. He was not trapped inside his first impression forever, and he was able to recognize growth when that growth became real. That matters because true discernment is not just about being stubborn. It is being able to say no when you must, and then saying yes when a person has actually changed. Some people try to turn grace into a way to deny reality, acting like consequences should just disappear if your tears are sincere enough. Others turn accountability into a life sentence, acting like one collapse tells you exactly who a person is for the rest of their life. Mark's story will not let you do either one of those things. The wound was real, and the trust was broken. But time passed, and the service kept going until Paul finally asked for him. That one sentence is the reason this story still lives today. So who was right? Paul or Barnabas? To be honest, both of them were. Paul was right about Mark's readiness then, and Barnabas was right about Mark's possibility later. That is the category this story gives us. Forgiveness can be immediate, but trust returns by stages because it has to survive real time, real work, and real testing. A man can be forgiven and still not ready, and that unreadiness does not have to lead to permanent disqualification. So, not yet is not always never. Paul guarded mission fitness. Barnabas guarded redemptive possibility. One kept the work from being treated lightly, and the other kept the worker from being treated as finished. The church still needs both. This is where the pattern becomes personal. Now we can finally name the shape of Mark's story plainly: fall, remodeling, and restoration. First, the fall. Some of you are there right now, not in theory and not as a Bible word. You know what happened, and you know that the clean version you tell people is not the whole story. Mark's story does not help you by making the failure small. It helps you by forcing honesty. He left. Paul remembered it, and the consequences stayed. So if you are in the fall, tell the truth about what happened. Stop hiding behind softer words that protect your pride but block your healing. Honest confession is where healing starts, because God deals with what is real, not with the polished version you hand to everybody else. Second, remodeling. Many people hate this stage because it feels hidden, slow, and unimpressive. Nothing flashy is happening. There is no dramatic public comeback. You are not trying to prove in a week what only years can prove. You are staying close to wise people. You are taking the assignment in front of you, and you are learning steadiness. You are letting your life become boring in the best way. Day after day, you show up. Day after day, you tell the truth. Day after day, you obey in small places where no camera is rolling and no crowd is clapping. And let's be real, this stage can feel unfair because your heart may already be broken over your sin, while other people still hesitate to trust you. But sorrow alone does not rebuild confidence. Time under obedience does. So if you are in remodeling, do not despise the quiet years. God does deep work there. The relationships that hold you accountable matter there. The ordinary tasks matter there. The repeated choice to remain faithful when nobody is impressed, that matters there. Third, restoration. When restored, usefulness starts to return. Receive it humbly. Do not grab for titles just because your shame is fading. Do not confuse the renewed opportunity with a right to control how everybody else sees you. Mark's later usefulness is beautiful because it looks earned through grace over time, not demanded through pressure. Restored trust is not something you seize. It is something you steward carefully. Some of you need a little more Paul in you. You keep putting people into burdens they are not ready to carry because you want the ending too fast. Others need a little more Barnabas in you. You can name a person's worst moment with exact detail, but you cannot imagine grace rebuilding them into someone dependable again. The church needs both truth and patience. It needs people who can say not yet and still mean not never. That is the shape of Mark's story: fall, remodeling, and restoration. Not all at once, not on demand, but really. Maybe Mark's story has shown you that failure does not have to become your identity. But there is another question you have to face. What do you do right after failure? When the shame is still fresh and you do not yet know whether you can come back. Peter lived that moment, and Jesus met him right there beside a charcoal fire. Watch that story next. Paul may have been right about the man Mark was, but Paul was not the author of the man Mark would become.